Okay, so we're gonna continue with our Rails without magic. Since Friday, did anyone have any questions or comments about the code we had been working on? Cool. So here's the repository. I can, oh, it's still within my atom, so that's good. And I will just run a few command prompts within that folder. Here, and one of them will run the server, and we can just make sure that the server's still running appropriately, like everything that we thought we had done last time is still active. So there we go. When we go to /students, we see all of the students. There's just 2 of them. We have some stylings. There's a very basic level of styling where we sort of put a border around our body and applied some styling to the different headers. And we can click on any individual student, see that student, go back to all. That still works. So we're in a good place right now. If we were to go to straight up localhost, we would still be on this "yay, you're on Rails" message. This is called the root route. So it's the root of our server. It has no pathing at all. And we probably don't want to leave it with just this congratulations message. For now, we can assume that like the main part of our application is this student's index. And we can make it so that if we go to the root, that it would also pull up the student's index, so that we don't have to always go to /students, that this would be, available just at the root. So let's do that. Let's open up our config routes file and add a root route. And we do that just by in the routes.rb file saying root to students index. Make sure that works. Yeah.
Where's the, oh, here we go.
It's in the config folder. You got it. So it's root to : where are we routing to? The students index action. Let me just make sure that actually worked. There it is. So now going to our domain without any pathing takes us to the students index action. And remember, the way we always mention controllers and actions is we type them out inside of a string and we separate them by a hash mark. So it's the controller on the left-hand side and the action on the right-hand side. And we've now got rid of that initial message. I can now add that change to my Git repository, added a root route to student index. And what I did after class last time is I did hook the Git repository that was local to my machine to GitHub. So now if I wanted to, I could push the changes to the remote and have that synchronized with the GitHub repo. Okay, so I thought what I would do with just sort of continuing on with this application is to show the rest of the CRUD things that we could do with a Rails application without magic. So we have the R of CRUD already done. We have our 2 sort of showing related parts of our application. When we want to show all of the students, we have defined this index route that goes to the index controller, and when we want to show an individual student, we can specify that by specifying by ID which individual student we wish to route to. All of that's happening inside of our students controller. And so you can see we have our 2 actions inside of there. I thought next up it might be handy to be able to create students by way of our application rather than before we created some students, we went to the Rails console, right? So we ran Rails C from a console and we added some students that way. It'd be nice to try to add some students actually by way of the web application. And so let's say we want to do some create routes. Create routes are going to come in pairs. There's going to be a route to display the form that we are going to fill out that's going to relate to a student. And then that form needs to post its data somewhere. And so we need a route to be able to receive that posted data. And then we need two controller actions for each one of those things. So we're going to have a controller action that we're going to name new. And the new action is just like the other ones. It's going to automatically load up a view. So this is going to automatically load up the app views students new.html.erb. This is going to be in charge of loading up a form. And so when that form gets posted, it's going to post somewhere else. I'm going to have it post to a create action, create in all lowercase though, and this action does not have an associated view. Because the act of creating a student, we don't need to display anything afterwards. We can redirect. So let's say we create a brand new student. We might want to redirect either to the index of all students to show that a new student has been created, or we could even redirect to the show page for the individual student that was just created. In either case though, we don't need a view associated with the create action itself. It simply needs to perform the action of taking in the posted data, talking to active record to make that student, and then either flagging us to the fact that we've made some validation errors or redirecting us to, we'll have it redirect to the show action is what we'll do. So I do need one new view, and so I will go make that new view. In the app views students folder, I need a new view, new.html.erb. And I can open that up here. So we've got an empty new view. Maybe just to put a little bit of something in there, I could say create a new student at the top of that page. This is where a form's going to go. So a form will go here. Over here we already have the action. It's empty. I'll be putting some code into there in a moment. But we need some routes now, and initially we just need a GET request, and we're going to have it so that when a browser or a client, HTTP client of any kind, makes a GET request to /student/new, that's when we want to go load up the student's new action, and I'll name it new student. By giving it a name, I can path to it by way of a link to. So in, say, for example, the index page, I can have a link that links to this new student path that will take us to this route. So I can do that as well. I'll open up the index. Right now the index is rendering out all students. Maybe below that, inside of a paragraph tag, I could have a link to with the text create new student that links to the new student underscore path. So anytime we use the as keyword in a route, we name a path, and then when we reference that path within our application, we just add _path to the end of that reference. So we named the route new student, and we pathed to it with new student path. All of these things wired together should allow us to see this link on the index page. When we click on this link, the new student path will trigger this route, which should then send our browser to /student/new, which should then trigger the student's new action, which will run this action. Currently doesn't do anything, but it'll go and load up our view, which will have us see the text create a new student. So if everything is working, we should be able to reload this page and see this link, and this link should take us to that page where we create a new student. That's good. This heading looks a little too big. I'll just change it to an H2. That looks better. So here's where a form's going to go. And if we were working in PHP, we would write this form ourselves. Right? We would we would create a form tag, and inside of this form, we would have a certain number of inputs and a certain number of maybe labels. You don't have to follow me here because I'm going to be removing these things eventually. But we might have like a label for the student's name, and then we might have an input of type text where we give it an ID, and it's awkward to have the name be named, but that's what it is. And then that's all our student has right now. The only property our student has is a name. And then we would have like an input of type submit to create that student. So sure, this will work in Rails as well. Like it renders any HTML we ask it to. So that would give us this form. But the Rails way of doing things is to have the form be aware of the active record object that we're actually going to be creating. And if we were working at the console, so if we're working at the Rails console, if we were making a new student object in sort of a multiple step manner, we would start by doing student.new. And student.new gives us a blank student object. And if we call save on that student, well, we would persist that student to the database. So what I'm going to do is in the student's controller, I'm going to create a new student, student.new. And so what that's going to do is it's going to give me access to this student object inside of the associated view, inside of that app view students new.html.erb. And inside here, I am not going to manually create my form. Instead, I'm going to use another Rails helper. And so we tend to use these helpers when we are going to be leaning on things like the routing system. So for example, we could manually create our own links in Rails, but if we want to make use of named paths, we use link to. Same thing goes for form. I can manually create a form, or I can say form for. What is the form for? It's for this blank student object that I just created in the controller that's associated with, or this controller action that's associated with this view. And form for takes a block, and it's going to give us access to something that we're going to call F inside of this block, and then I'm going to end it. Even without anything inside of this block, we're going to get some output in the HTML. The output likely won't be visible, but if we view source, we'll be able to see it. So we have form for. It's important that you have this echoing because you want this form to actually be injected inside of the HTML. So it has to be the less than %equals to have it echo. And then do F. We haven't yet made use of this F. F is going to be something called a form builder. It's going to help us build the various pieces of the form. If we go to our page and we view source, you can see just having that form for student alone has done something for us. If we view the source, we have a form object or a form element. It has a class of new student applied to it. It's automatically set up to post to /students, which, okay, that makes sense. We don't have a route for that yet, but we will make one. And then the form itself gets closed. There's also a hidden input inside of, in fact, there's two hidden inputs inside of this form. One hidden input is called UTF-8, and it contains an entitized version of a UTF-8 symbol. This is simply to allow Rails to test if the client it is interacting with supports UTF-8 encoding. So if the client can properly submit this UTF-8 character, Rails knows that the client properly understands UTF-8 encoding. One of the biggest problems with the web is encoding problems. Like, so if you've been navigating the web and you get to a web page and sometimes you'll see that little diamond with a question mark in it, that's an encoding problem. When the browser is trying to decode characters from a different character set than the one that the web page is claiming to be encoded in. So this helps us just deal with that issue. Rails just deals with that behind the scenes for us. The second thing is this authenticity token, and it's a big long set of characters, and Rails generates these characters, and when this form gets posted, it makes sure that the characters it put into this hidden input are posted back to it. And this is because there's all sorts of scripts that just navigate the web. So these are malicious scripts that just navigate the web, submit forms, and try to auto-hack websites. They do this by trying to inject SQL or inject cross-site scripting attacks. And this is just like base level 1 of stopping those kind of auto-injected hacks, because if the script is just posting at every form it finds, it won't be posting this value. Yes, you could create a script that would first read a form, find the token, and then post the form, but it's just one extra step to stop sort of these rogue scripts. So those are done automatically for us. We don't need to worry about those at all. The key thing we do want to worry about is the fact that when we submit this form, it's going to post, HTTP post, to /students. So I need a route to deal with that. So I'll go to my routing file, and I will make a route, and it's going to be the first route where we don't start with get. I start with post here. Indent the rest of these so they're all lined up. Post to /students. So when I get a post request to /students, this should go to the students create action that I already have inside of my controller. That's this thing right here, waiting to receive posted data. So a post request to /students will trigger that action. This is interesting. This is something that if you're from web application in a non sort of Railsy world, you now have two URLs that act differently depending on the verb used with them, which is something might be a little bit strange, right? You have the URL /students. When it is requested by way of a GET request, we see an index of all of the students. When you post to the exact same URL, it does something completely different. So the same URL performs different actions depending on the verb. This is how HTTP was supposed to work. And Rails sort of works sort of hand in hand with HTTP in this way. In other web applications, or like vanilla PHP apps, we don't tend to work in this way. We sometimes sort of fight with how HTTP was originally supposed to be designed. So there you go. We have two URLs that respond differently or do different things based on the verbs they're used with. Okay, that's all well and good. That still doesn't really help us though, because we don't actually still have anything in our form. We have a form, it should properly receive a post because now we have a route to receive that post. but we need some contents to that form. This is when this form builder comes in handy. It's going to build the different pieces of our form, and those pieces will be aware of the active record model in question. So this form builder here is aware of the student in question because we passed it into the form for call. And so within here, I can do things like echo out f.label. What is this label for? It's a label for the student's name. And I also want a f.text field. And what's that for? Well, that's also going to be for the student's name. And lastly, I want a f.submit because that is going to give my form a submit button. So all three of these f. commands are going to generate pieces of our form. This will generate a label element. This will generate a input element of type text with the appropriate name attribute set. And this will create an input element of type submit. So let's go see that in action. It'll probably generate a pretty ugly looking form. But we don't need to worry too much about styling yet. Everything's sort of across the top here. We can worry about that a little bit later. So here's our label for the name. Here's the actual input. Here's the button. If we view source like we did before, we can see the pieces that were built for us. There's the label, there's the input, there's the submit button. Notice that the name isn't just name, but it actually talks about what it is a name for. It's a name for a student. If I now submit this form, we'll get an error, but we should at least see what it does. Oops, I don't want that there. Let's see what happens. I'll put a name in here. It'll be Kyle Geske, and I will try to create this student. And it sits there and it does nothing at all. Okay, so I need to wire up the create side of the picture here. That's this end. When I get a student posted to me, well, I still need to do something along the lines of like creating that student. And I need to also test to see if the creation passes validation or not. And so if I go and play around in my Rails console here, student.create, if I don't give it a name, it gets rolled back and I get a sort of a blank student back in return. So let's go and create a new student. We'll call it student. And we will create it. And what do we need to create it with? We need to create it with some parameters that are coming to us by way of the params hash, this thing right here. Now this gets a little bit tricky. In the early days of Rails, we would just say params at position student and be done with it. We can't do that anymore because of the fact that there was a type of way of attacking Rails applications called mass assignment attacks, where people could create their own forms on their own machines, submit those to a Rails application, and they could add any parameter of a student that they wanted. So imagine a student also had, say, like a GPA field that we did not want to be accessible by the outside world. If I just took in all the params that came from a student form, someone could cleverly craft their own student form with the GPA field included, put their GPA to 4.5 or whatever, and submit that to my form, and Rails would happily either create or update that student with that data. This was known from the early days of Rails, and most of the Rails core team was aware of it, and they would just say, okay, you have to be aware of this as a Rails developer, just don't allow for mass assignment. But it wasn't fixed as it wasn't seen as a bug. Now, GitHub is itself written as a Rails application, and there was someone who posted to the Rails project on GitHub saying, there's this bug in Rails, it's a mass assignment bug, and the core team again replied, we don't consider this a bug, we're not going to fix it. Rails developers have to take this into account. And then this account that had logged this bug started doing weird things. It started like posting messages to this thread from the past and from the future, and then posting as David Hanemar Hansen. And it turns out that GitHub had this bug in it, and the Rails developers at GitHub were not dealing with this mass assignment bug. And so this person could take over the identity of David Hanemar Hansen, or could inject times from the past and the future into the thread. And so that got well, first the GitHub security team stepped in, and then the Rails security team stepped in, and then they said, okay, we'll fix this problem. It is a problem. So sometimes you have to push in a sort of a white hat kind of way for security issues to be fixed. I thought that was a pretty clever way of handling it. Initially, GitHub banned this user from GitHub, but then when they realized that he wasn't actually trying to hack them, that he was just trying to show this security hole, that they let him back into the system. So what do we have to do to deal with that? What I'm going to do for us is I'm going to look at how Rails deals with this when we generate a scaffolded application. So I'm going to go to a previous application that we built, just a simple store, and I'm going to look at the controller of, it was products that we were working with. If we look at their create action, they are creating a @product with product.new, similar to what we're doing with a student.new, but they're using something called product params. And this isn't something special with Rails. This is just a function that's defined down below. We're going to need to create a function like this defined down below, and I'm just going to copy and paste this and bring it into our application and change it to match our app. So what we want to do is, right now, all of the methods we've put in this student's controller are actions, and because they're public. I want something that is not publicly routable. I just want a private method on the student controller. So I'm going to start with the private keyword. I'm going to paste this into place here. We saw the params hash. We made use of it earlier when we were pulling out the ID that was passed to us by way of a route. It's the same params hash we're using, but what we're going to do is we're going to specify what is required. It's a student that's required when we're using it in terms of this create action. So I'm going to type in student here. And then this is where we get rid of the mass assignment attack. What follows is a whitelist of the properties of the thing we are working with that we want to be allowed to be modified by the outside world. We only have one property in its name. And so we whitelist our name for our student, and then we're going to change the name of this. It's not a product that we're working with, it's a student we're working with. And so inside of our create action, we can say create the new student based on student params. And the student params are going to be, it's going to require that a student was passed into the parameter, and we're going to permit the name or whitelist the name as something that we are allowing to be set from the outside world. Okay, we could have also just done that in line within the method. The reason why we break it out to its own private method is as we continue to add to this project, we're probably going to create an update method as well. And the update method is going to need to do the same thing. So by abstracting it out to a method, we can use this student params in two places. So we're looking a little bit into the future. Okay, create a new student. That doesn't yet persist it though, right? We have to save it to persist it. So I can say if student.save, so if the validations passed, if the validations pass. Well, here's where I was talking about the fact that this action doesn't actually have any associated views. So if the validation passes, let's go and show that student in question. So let's redirect to the student. And by redirecting to the student, Rails will go to the routing file and it will load up the student path associated with that particular student, and it'll pass in the proper ID. Otherwise, this is if the validations fail. Well, what do we want to do if the validations fail? We want to show the same form with some validation messages saying that this thing is in error. So we don't need to go to a whole new page. We just need to render a view that we already have. We already have this new view, which is the form itself. So I want to render the new view. So render the view associated with the new action, which is that new.html.erb. So we're either redirecting to the show. This is redirect to show action for this student, or show the form again. So our form is going to need to be augmented slightly so that it can actually support showing the error messages. But there's our two different paths. Did the save work? Did the save not work? We should now be able to create new students from the web. So let's go make sure things are working. So go to this new screen for the first time or reload it. There's my form. Try to create myself as a student. Create student. And now I've been redirected to students/4, and this is the Kyle Geske page for student 4. Go back again, create a new student again. If I try to create, in fact, I'll show you that redirection in action. That's one thing I might be able to do here. I may not though, because a lot of this happens behind the scenes in terms of JavaScript. So we may not actually see a redirect happen here. It might be that JavaScript just literally changes the DOM and makes it look like we've changed pages. Rails does all sorts of weird and complicated stuff using JavaScript in the back end than actually doing full page redirects. So let's see if we actually see this happening or not. New student. And what do we end up seeing? We see a post request, and we do see 302. And so a 302 status code is a redirect. That's the location redirect that you can do manually in PHP with the location header. And so yeah, it redirected us to this page. And what happens if I create a student that is blank, remembering the fact that our validation on the student model had a presence requirement for the name? Brings us back here. The formatting of my form changed slightly. It was all aligned, and now it's sort of top to bottom. That's because when there are fields in error, Rails will wrap each one of those fields in a div and give it a particular class. So you can purposefully style fields that are in error. So you can make fields that are in error like red, for example. And so that this doesn't change the look of our form from here to here, we can do a few things. We can go into our form and let's just put some divs around things ourselves. And I'll leave the submit button there. So I'm just wrapping my label and my text field in a div in hopes that now when I go here, and when I go here, yeah, they look the same. So every time I click this, it looks the same. Oops, that's not a known path. I would also like to be able to display some error messages. Again, to do this, I find the easiest way to go and augment our form with support for error messages is just to look how a scaffolded app does this. So if I go back to my simple store and I go into my app views products folder, if I look in the new, you can see there's a partial being rendered, and the partial is called form. So we have our form directly inside of our new. In the scaffolded app, it's making use of a partial. That's because the same form is used for both new and update. We may get to that point in our application as well. So if we go and look at what's inside of that form partial, we can see the stuff in question is right here. I'm gonna have to grab all of this and modify it. It goes inside of my form 4, but I have to modify it in a way that it says right here, if products or product errors any, this should be at student. So if there are any errors detected, render this div. If there are no errors, don't bother rendering the div, just render the form in and of itself. Then it uses a method, super handy method called Pluralize. Have you ever output text in a application where that text is mentioning a number? So in our case, it would be like, there are 12 errors prohibiting this form from being posted, but if there's only a single error, you don't want to say errors, you want to say error. That's a very common programmer thing to have to deal with. And so Rails gives us something called Pluralize, where we mention what the number we're dealing with is. It's the student errors count, and then the word that needs to be pluralized. And what this will do is it'll print out one error if count is 1, or 2 errors if the count is 2 or greater. And so pluralize the count, the word that we're pluralizing is error, prohibited this student from being saved. And then we can loop over all of the student errors. So it's student errors full messages is just the way of getting all of the messages out in in English. And then for each message, we are building an LI, echoing the message inside of that LI. The whole thing's inside of a UL. Let me just make sure this actually works, and then I'll come back to the code. So here we are. I go to this form to create a new student. I submit an empty student. One error prohibited the student from being saved. Name can't be blank. I can put the name in now. Actual name. Submit it. There you go. The nice thing about the way this is done is if there was many other properties in the form, so maybe there was a name and like a description and an age or all other things, those bits of data would get echoed back into the form so that the user wouldn't lose all of that context, which is also a really nice thing. You don't want to have someone make a single mistake on a form and have them lose all of the rest of their data. So here's the code again. It's this whole if-and block right here. If the student errors, if there are any of them, output this div, pluralize the error count and the word error, and then loop it. And I think that's a pretty good place for us to be done for the day. So I will commit this to version control, which I wasn't so good about doing incrementally today, but here we're gonna say git add, git commit, implemented and routed the student new and student create actions. And I can push that up to GitHub. So if you didn't get all of that error code, you can then grab it from the Git repository. And that gets us to a point where we now have our show and our create, in terms of our CRUD actions, right, it's create, read, update, and delete. We've done the first two now. We've done the C and the R. This afternoon, we can do the U and the D. The U is going to lean heavily on the work that we already did for the create. We already have the form built, and that doesn't need to be reworked. We can maybe turn that form into a partial, so we can rip out the repetition that's inside of the new form, put it into a partial, and use it inside of the new, and the edit page, and then delete is going to be the final step. It will be the fact that on our students page, we would like to have maybe a delete button beside each student, allowing us to delete the students. We'll be left with a fully sort of CRUD application for students. The problem will be that if a user came to this website, just a regular old user, they would have full CRUD access to our application, which is probably what we don't want. If you're building a e-commerce store for your project, you're not going to want to have your users, your customers, being able to edit and add products and all those kind of things. And so there's usually a need to separate out the administrative back end of your application from the front end. A couple different ways of doing that. One, we could have we could put passwords, very simple passwords if we wanted to. Just like a single username and password. Rails allows us to do that. We could put that on the edit and the update and the create. Or we could just completely separate out the application to have like an admin backend and a customer front end. And there are some wonderful gems in the Rails ecosystems that will just build the whole backend for us. And so that's when we're going to bring the magic back in. There's a gem called Active Admin that we install into our application, and then it just inspects everything. It looks at the database, it looks at the models, and it builds the whole administrative backend for us automatically. So after doing all of the work of building this out without magic, we'll then strip out some of the stuff that we built, and we'll just magically create the whole backend. So that's what we'll do this afternoon.